All right. Morning, everyone. How's everyone doing today?
There you go.
Bright and early. Thank you for being here. Appreciate it. I'm Alex Williams, founder and editor-in-chief of the New Stack, and we have these Pancake breakfast conferences, and we couldn't do it without our sponsors, so I wanted to give a big shout out to Pivotal for making this possible. Let's give a big hand to Pivotal. This is being recorded, and we will publish it later as a podcast on the New Stack Analysts. One of the things that we try to do with these Pancake breakfasts is to make them a chance for every one of you to ask a question, to get some conversation going with the people who we have on our panel. And what we also do is then we provide you a ticket for an Arduino, and everyone has a ticket, right? And here's the catch, okay? If you ask a question, you get 5 more tickets.
Wow.
So that's a benefit. It's not a catch, it's a benefit, right? So I just want to get started and just introduce the panel, and then I'd like to ask Cornelia just to share a word about Pivotal and their sponsorship of the breakfast. We have Abby Kearns, the Executive Director of the Cloud Foundry Foundation. Hey, Abby.
Hello.
Cornelia Davis. And Daniel Jones of Engineering Better. Rick Riobly of Comcast and Stephen O'Grady of RedMonk. And I would be wrong to leave out the Cloud Foundry Foundation, who has supported so many Pancake breakfasts, and so thank you to them for making this possible. Another shout out to the Cloud Foundry Foundation, please. So, Cornelia.
Yeah.
Tell it. Well, yeah. Let's hear the story here.
Yes.
Oh, did I? I forgot Stephen O'Grady. I'm just not on it this morning. Stephen O'Grady of RedMonk.
All good.
One of the most respected analysts in the business, so thank you for joining us, Stephen.
Yeah, no worries.
All right.
Great.
Am I on? Yeah, sounds like I'm on. So thank you, Alex, very much. And thank you all for coming. On behalf of Pivotal, we are delighted to sponsor the breakfast this morning. And I just wanted to say a couple of words that really maybe are in alignment with our theme for this morning, which is adaptation. Pivotal, as you know, it was largely behind the original Cloud Foundry. And you will see at this conference that our customers have been hugely successful with Cloud Foundry, with the open source and with our commercial distribution as well. And that has been kind of our flagship product for the last 4, 5, 6 years. We just turned 6 2 days ago or 3 days ago. And you'll see those stories of success all over the conference. But one of the things that's really interesting that's happened in the last couple of years is particularly driven by those hugely successful customers. They've come to us and said, hey, we've been hugely successful with cloud-native applications, or in refactoring some of our existing applications. Can't you help us with more? Can't you help us with our COTS software? Can't you help us with the stuff that's already containerized? And so that is what we've been doing. That's how Pivotal's been adapting in the last several years. We initially, a couple of years ago, started to incubate what is now CFCR, which is the container runtime. We are collaborating with Google on Knative, which is a layer that sits on top of Kubernetes that starts, it's not quite Cloud Foundry, but it starts to dabble at a little bit more of a developer-friendly abstraction. We're also building out Pivotal Function Service, which is based on the open source RIF. And so we're super delighted that, that really the way that our customers have been adapting to new workloads, it's all about broadening the set of workloads, that our commitment to open source and then our commitment to creating kind of turnkey shrink-wrap products for you as well is one of the ways that you're seeing us adapt in a huge way in the last few years. It's not only about the traditional Cloud Foundry application runtime product anymore. So it's all about adaptation. And again, thank you so much for coming, and thanks for the opportunity to sponsor the breakfast this morning.
Well, thank you, Cornelia. And I just want to get started because, it's interesting because what you just mentioned there, like Cloud Foundry's roots date back to 2008. And I was going to ask the panel, how has your job in the past 2 years? But Stephen, you remember when Cloud Foundry was first announced. How has your work changed in those past 10 years? Open source has taken on such a momentum over that time. I would just love to hear everyone's kind of thinking about, in retrospective, about those years and how that brings us forward now into this new realm that we're starting to see in terms of adaptation is greater than adoption.
Sure. Well, I guess I'll answer that one. I'll field that. I mean, I think the biggest change for me, from a project standpoint, obviously much has changed with the project. It was originally written in Ruby. Portions have been rewritten in Go. So the actual underlying source code itself has changed many times over the years. Certainly has evolved, from a functional capability standpoint. But the biggest one is that, sort of very much in keeping with the theme, is that the project debuted, if I'm right, in, 2011? Is that right?
Yeah, 2011.
And then Docker dropped in 2013. So, the project has had to sort of reimagine itself and evolve, right? In a world where, it was born into a world where containers were not a thing, and, had to, sort of, find its way in a world in which containers very much were a thing. So, I mean, that change alone, has sort of redefined the way that people have viewed the project and the way that the project viewed itself. So, to me, that's been one of the biggest adaptations it had to make.
Abby, any thoughts on how your work has changed over the past few years in terms of the foundation and its direction?
Well, I've been part of the Cloud Foundry ecosystem for 5 years now. Here in Pivotal 6, I was like, wow, it's been a long time. I think when I first started working with Cloud Foundry, I spent a lot of time explaining what a platform as a service was, what containers were, and you spend a lot of time explaining how the things worked. And I feel like now there's a lot less time spent on explaining how these things work, but more of how do you tie this to value. And in the foundation over the last 3 years has evolved to where interoperability and adaptation are very much front and center of our strategic initiatives. And making sure the technology, the community, and the ecosystem continue to evolve, because the industry around us, the cloud native industry, is changing and changing quickly. And as a key technology in that, we have to do the same or risk being left behind.
Dan, I'm curious in the work that you do and the customers who you talk to and how that's reflected in the change in your work.
Sure. I think certainly with the customers that we have in the early, Engineer Better as an organization has existed for 3 years. I've been working with Cloud Foundry since before Pivotal was even Pivotal, before it had a name. I think one of the shifts that we've seen in the market more generally is that in the early years, we were dealing with people who responded very strongly to that motivator of, we're a large organization, startups are coming for our lunch, the likes of Amazon are coming for our lunch, we need to be able to become agile very, very quickly. And I think more recently, there's been a shift towards people, I'll be blunt, saying things like, we've got to have a Kubernetes strategy. Why? And all of a sudden, people are getting very distracted with the hamster wheel of changing VMs for containers, and not necessarily with an eye on the value. I'm not sure necessarily that the size or the number of people focusing on improving the delivery of user value has diminished, but there's certainly a lot more noise around this other stuff. I'm thinking like, is that a healthy distraction?
Right. Cornelia, I know you've talked to companies all the time. Perhaps what you could reflect on the observations you have about the changes you're seeing with companies and how that's reflecting in your own work as well.
Yeah, and I also want to add on to a couple of things that Abby and Daniel said as well. Definitely about tying it to business value. We're in the middle of this major hype cycle around Kubernetes, where everybody does want to just go for the big shiny object without really understanding what the business value is. And I also, to add to what Abby said, one of the things that's really interesting is, yes, we used to have to talk a lot about distributed systems. We had to talk about declarative ways of doing, eventually consistent, the way that Kubernetes, or the way that Cloud Foundry has for a lot longer than Kubernetes has even been around. And we don't have to do that level of education anymore, but we still have now the opportunity to take that as a base bit of knowledge and then add to that, helping people understand that they really are doing distributed systems and that they need a level of resilience. And that something core like the declarative model and the continuous reconciliation loop is really important. So, that's more on the technology side. I wanted to add in that there's still an awful lot for us to learn from a technology front. It isn't only the business value. I would totally agree with what my co-panelists have said here as well.
All right, great. So Rick.
Alex, I think there's a question.
Oh, we're gonna right after this, we're gonna go to questions. So I just want to ask you, Rick. I mean, you work for one of the largest telecommunications technology company, customer experience companies in the world. I only mentioned those three things because that was part of a discussion yesterday and how Comcast has changed so much from that traditional telecom operator to more of a company that really is focusing on the customer. How's that affected you and your work and your?
Yeah. So I took this job as CIO about 2 years ago. So my world has changed a lot in the last 2 years, and our big focus has been about improving the customer experience, and that it's more than just deploying great products. It's about how do we create this end-to-end customer experience. And really the key to unlocking that in many cases is a lot of the IT infrastructure, right? A lot of those back-end systems where you've got data in a lot of different places, and legacy systems, and how do you modernize them and tie them to digital properties that customers can interact with. And so we've been doing a lot of work. A lot of the change we've gone through as an IT organization in the last 2 years is really, it's probably less about the technology and more about the culture and the way we interact with the business, and the way that I think a lot of IT organizations are set up as, I'll say, I hate to say this in a negative way, but somewhat order takers, right? Where the business comes and says, do this, do this, do this, and the IT organizations do each of those things in individual projects. And so we've really tried to shift towards thinking in terms of platforms. And we think in terms of platforms and reusable capabilities, and how do we do things once and then get to use it over and over again. And it's been a big mind shift, both from the business side of things as well as our technology teams, of when we're looking at the problems we're trying to solve as a company, how do we build reusable technology platforms? And where we've done that on the product side over the last 5-6 years is where you've probably seen big advances in our products with the X1 platform and voice remotes and XFi and a lot of really most magical product experiences we've created. We're trying to take that same mindset now and apply it in the IT space.
Excellent. So I would love to have some questions. Are there some questions? Yeah,
right,
sure.
one right here.
And just before we get the question, I want to introduce Job Jackson, who is managing editor of the New Stack and co-host for today's breakfast.
Go ahead and say your name.
All right, Rashid Abdulaziz from Pivotal. My question is probably to Cornelia, but also Cloud Foundry and anyone who's adopted Kubernetes. What specific scientific methodology did you all use for arriving at, it's not just new and shiny, but there's real value in using that? And would you have applied that if it was something that didn't have the same sort of groundswell as something like Kubernetes?
Yeah, so I'll start with the very last thing that you said. Would we have gone there if it didn't have the groundswell? I'm not sure. On the one hand, absolutely, because quite frankly, we have been doing a lot of the things that Kubernetes does in the product for the last 6, 7, 8 years. It was just an implementation detail. I think that what has happened with the hype of Kubernetes is that what was an implementation detail has become something that's front and center. And that's really what I was trying to get at with that point, which is now that people are actually talking about what used to be an implementation detail, that opens up the possibility of us using this primitive now in new and different ways That's the whole point. Now, the science around that, I'm not sure that it's entirely science. I love that you asked that question, and especially coming from Pivotal, that's what we, to a large extent, do, is we try to come up with the process, the scientific process to drive these things. And yes, I think that there's a certain level of science. We, of course, want to do things like analyze the market and those types of things. But there's a bit of art on that as well. And that is to, first of all, my personal approach is to understand those primitives at such a level that we aren't just using them in the prescribed way, because it's when you open your mind to using it in a non-prescribed way, in a non-necessarily Cloud Foundry specific way, traditional Cloud Foundry product, that we have the opportunity to get beyond the proverbial faster horse to the automobile, right? And so the science with that is, in the way that I like to think about it, is that we form hypotheses, understand that technology at a deep level, form hypotheses, and then do these types of things. Start sharing ideas very, very openly. And that's where I love the open source community and the way that open source has really radically changed industry, the IT industry, from the time that I started 30 years ago in the tech to the way it is now. Because we used to have this philosophy of as a company, we're going to keep everything within our four walls until we have the brilliant insight. Right. And so I think the open source community is a big part of that.
Right. Great. Questions?
I have a question.
Greg?
Wait for the mic. Hi, Greg Otto from Comcast. The question is for, especially for Stephen and Daniel, the development teams that are generally more successful, have you seen in your experience, and Abby and Cornelia for sure can jump in, is there a common traits? Are there things that separate, those more successful teams that are delivering business value versus those that are just mesmerized by the shiny objects?
I'll take a quick stab at that. I'll get the quote wrong. I don't remember it, unfortunately, as well as I'd like. There's a great quote talking about why the Roman Empire was successful, and essentially what it comes back to is that they never met essentially a better way of making war that they didn't then adopt, right? And essentially one of the things you see as a characteristic of developer teams is, there's obviously a tendency that for probably everybody in the room has heard of, the not invented here syndrome, right? Which is, I have this thing, this is exactly the right way to do it, and we invented it here, so it's better than anything else. And in our experience, developer teams that are flexible and versatile enough to say, hey, is there a better way to do this? Great, we'll pick up and sort of run with that. And I don't mean that sort of in a trivial sense, because you never want to be flitting from technology to technology piecemeal. That sort of, so there's a balance to be sought here. But I think being pragmatic about technology and technology adoption, I think, is critically important, because it's, we say this all the time. There's a sort of tendency in this industry, because sort of so many of us are engineers, to believe that sort of intrinsically the best engineered product will win. In our experience, having looked at, having done this job for a long time, having looked at, certainly the history going back much further than we've been around, the history of the industry demonstrates pretty conclusively that not only doesn't the best product win every time, it doesn't win most of the time, right? So things that are adopted, whether you agree with them or not, sort of at scale, take on a power of their own. So again, from a developer team standpoint, being sort of humble enough to sort of embrace things, it does play a critical role in your success.
I think Stephen's point about humility and being humble is important. I perhaps am biased as being a simpleton myself, but I'm deeply suspicious of excessively smart engineers. And I think about the development teams that I've worked on that have been most effective have been the ones that work well as a unit and are trying to do the right thing, whatever that might be, rather than, I can think of some engineers that I've worked with over the years who have been geniuses away in a corner, typing away with headphones on, churning out internal framework after internal framework after internal framework with no documentation that nobody understands, stick a couple of Java annotations on a thing, bazing, everything works. And then that person leaves because they're very smart and they've been headhunted by somebody else, and you're all screwed. So I think the trait that I've seen is people that are willing to be more social, people that are willing to have strong opinions, loosely held, and try and work together for the better of the team. It's very...
So where do you fit in the brilliant ones? Because you need them.
Well, I mean, I think that...
I mean, you don't necessarily need them, but very smart people can be very helpful.
Indeed, and I think there's an important point to make there about diversity and complex systems being resilient, in that if you have a completely homogeneous set of people, then that is fragile by its very nature. You know, if you've got all of the bricks in your wall are lined up the same way, then one point of force will crack those. If you've got people, a population of organisms with exactly the same immune system, then a new virus or whatever comes up, ecosystem will be decimated. So you need people, some amount of people that can be those geniuses that will come up with the next great thing. Whether you need a whole team of them, that, as a manager myself and a CTO, I think that sounds like a recipe for disaster. So, you know, the 80-20 rule.
Great.
I'd love to add something to that. One of the things that's really interesting is that we used to take the super genius people, and I found that a lot of enterprises used to have this enterprise architecture group, right? They were the ivory tower. They were thought of as the people who were the smartest ones. Therefore, we're going to put them in this ivory tower. They're going to write the white papers, and everybody's going to follow what they do. One of the things that we have helped our customers do, and with great success, is to take those enterprise architecture teams, and instead of having them isolated in their ivory tower, actually have them pairing into teams so that you get that diversity, so that you still get the smart people. And by the way, the genius and the collaborative doesn't have to be mutually exclusive.
Yes.
And so there's that brilliance. And by the way, those people that used to be in the ivory tower, when they start actually going out and pairing into the teams and participating as a member of the teams, they like their jobs a whole heck of a lot better than they did before.
Great. Questions?
Well, I got a question, unless anybody else has one. I'm very curious about what, for Cloud Foundry users, what the potential benefits of serverless will be. How does that save time in the development and deployment process? Or is there an argument for it, or is Cloud Foundry pretty much set without serverless, because it's kind of serverless already?
I know there's a discussion about it today, later on, about serverless and function as a service, and there was a study recently done. I mean,
This is Dave from Comcast. I mean, it's a strange coincidence. I was about to ask the same question.
okay, yeah, go ahead.
So I was referring to the same thing, the new buzzword, the new shiny thing about serverless platforms. So with the advent of IoT, and especially we are in the cable and networking domain, and IoT's home security is kind of the thing for us. So how do you see serverless platforms or function as a service is shaping up? Is this still a new shiny thing, or is it something kind of behind the scenes, or how does it come in relation to Cloud Foundry?
Well, I mean, I'll take a first stab, and Cornelia, I'm sure you have opinions, and DJ. I do think serverless is emerging. It's still early, but it is serverless, and I think we haven't all come to a clear definition of serverless. I think we use serverless and functions as service interchangeably. I do know for a fact, and this was actually part of our last round of research, that serverless companies, enterprise companies around the world that are using or evaluating serverless is growing exponentially, quarter over quarter. So companies are interested in it. But what we also found in our research, and this actually isn't in the publication that we just released, is that most people don't understand what it is. And so I think you kind of have that disconnect where it's an interesting emerging technology, and I think serverless and event-driven architecture can solve a lot of interesting problems, but it doesn't solve all the problems. And I think we do risk overhyping it to the point where there's a lot of confusion between the difference between a serverless, event-driven architectures, cloud-native applications, and microservices, and I think we're starting to put them all in one bucket. And I do think we need to separate them out, but realizing that for organizations, particularly the size of Comcast, you're going to be looking at all of the technologies because you have so many different workloads.
I mean, but I like to turn this to Rick, because like we were talking, beforehand about this, and there's like, I think you described it as digital lipstick, right? Like there was this kind of time before where like, everyone had a widget, everyone had like their own site, right?
Right.
And, and so you're managing thousands of engineers, and in fact, you're managing from a CIO perspective, a much larger organization. So how do you manage with this, how do you deal with this digital lipstick issue?
Yeah, and the reference to digital lipstick is so when we think about digital, we spend a lot of time on creating great digital interactions with our customers, and if you don't have a digital core that supports it, right? If you've got data everywhere and you've got legacy systems and your fundamental business isn't really digitized, but you're creating digital interactions, it can sometimes feel superficial, right? You can only go so deep with the types of interactions you can support with it, right? And so that's why I call it digital lipstick, just to reference that until you start to digitize, until you sort of get a good grip on your data and you sort of digitize a lot of the core business processes underneath, when you start doing these digital interactions with customers, you can do some basic things, but when a customer tries to go across channels, interact with us across different channels, or try to go really deep, right, where let's say you call us and you go to our website and you're having a problem with your internet, what we want to be able to do is have a whole digital back-end system that actually understands the context of what's going on in your home at that moment, and be able to pull that in, that customer context, and then be able to make AI-based recommendations on how to fix your problem versus sending you to sort of a question-answer flow of how to solve your problem. And so when we think about what digital means to us, there's the digital interactions and sort of that first layer that you interact with, but the more we digitize back-end systems, the more we can create like really great experiences for you. So that's what we're spending a lot of time working on right now.
So for the audience out here, who in this organization, who in the audience here is going through a digital transformation, so to speak? No one.
No one but me.
I don't, because I would like to try to know what it means too, because obviously, it's used all the time, right? This is another shiny new phrase, right? Digital the digital transformation of an organization, right?
Well, I had a question though about when you're talking about different functionalities across different business groups. This may be a question for Rick. Initially, how do you facilitate that exchange when every business group has their own goals they need to hit? How do you do these kind of cross channel collaborations?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's actually, when I reference what we've been working on for the last 2 years, that was really one of the big things. Was what we did is we stopped thinking about our technology as supporting all the different business units. We ended up establishing platforms, and so we said, we have a platform around sales. It doesn't matter what business group's interacting with us, we're going to create one reusable sales platform, and we're going to make it multi-channel. We're going to digitize it, and when I say digitize it, I generally mean we don't need humans. We can manage transactions from front to back without humans getting involved, without any kind of phone calls and papers and process and all that. And so that's been a big part of our transformation on the IT side over the last 2 years, is figuring out how to build a platform around sales, build a platform around service and support, and then have all the different business units really interact with a common platform that allows us to sort of do things once as opposed to doing things 5 or 6 different times.
May I go back to functions?
Sure.
Serverless. We've worked with people that we've delivered serverless proof of concepts for folks. We are yet to encounter a customer who wants to use serverless or functions service, depending on how you want to semantically split those two. We're yet to encounter anyone that wants them because it's going to increase their agility or decrease their time to market. everybody has asked about it because they want better utilization out of their hardware. So, and I'm at risk of enraging Jules on this one. I see it as a billing model. Until software engineers are viewing things and conceptualizing how they're going to solve problems as pure stateless functions, it's just a billing model. When engineers are sat at their desk with their laptop and there is a good IDE that lets them model things in a serverless fashion, then I think maybe we'll start to see a shift. But everything that you can do in terms of computer science with serverless, you can do already in a monolith. I gave a talk at CF Summit a couple of years ago called SOD microservices, which was service-oriented design microservices, and talking about how you can take event-driven architecture, stick it in a monolith. All of the things that serverless is almost like a forcing function for good design, in the same way that things like Cloud Foundry and Heroku become a forcing function for 12-factor apps. So I'm not convinced of the benefit yet, maybe when the developer ecosystem matures. And I mean, we see in the foundation ecosystem that trying to get people onto making 12-factor apps is enough of a challenge. We're fairly universal. That's a better way of doing things. So trying to get people into writing functions first in a sensible and idiomatic way is probably going to be a while off yet.
Yeah, just as in support of that, my colleague Rachel Stevens, who's actually at the back of the room, I think came up with a great definition from a serverless standpoint. Because we talked about sort of the initial definition of serverless came about in 2014 when Lambda was introduced. And as Abby referred to, was sort of has been, generally speaking, sort of used interchangeably with functions as a service. We're beginning to see that change, but to the point that it's a billing model, sort of as Rachel characterized it, increasing the definition of serverless is a model that can be taken to zero, right? So in other words, you're not paying for it when you're not using it. The actual implementation details of the technology can be, sort of variable, right? In many cases, it is functions or events, but in other cases, a serverless billing model, right? May be, base compute, or containers or something else that we're familiar with. So, yeah, I think, when you talk serverless, when you talk, about sort of the adoption within the enterprise, the first thing you have to do is decide, what are we actually talking about? What do we mean when we say serverless?
Yeah, I'd love to add one more thing to that. So number one, we are serverless. Cloud Foundry is serverless. By a big portion of that definition. Yeah, okay, maybe we don't scale to zero, but dynamic scaling, all of those types of things. To me, serverless, the serverless word is probably the wrong word for what I see as the greatest potential. And it goes back to something that Daniel said just a moment ago. And that is that we've been working very hard as a group, as an industry, to really teach 12-factor cloud native patterns and all of those types of things. I think that the thing that I'm excited about serverless is more around the event-driven than I am about the serverless part. And yeah, the billing model is interesting and all of that stuff. But I see this as a new potential frontier because even when it comes to cloud-native architectures, for the most part, most of the patterns that we teach and most of the patterns that are being adopted, and even the tooling around it, like circuit breakers and retries and things like that, still fundamentally assumes a request response protocol. And I think that serverless is very interesting in that it gives us the opportunity to actually turn that on its head and say, what can we do? And when it comes to distributed systems, request response, RPC, is not necessarily the best model. Forgive me for putting my propeller hat on, but that's where I'm the most excited about serverless. Please don't ever make me build a HTTP web service using serverless. I can do that in my sleep with Spring Boot. I am not going to go do that with a serverless function and then wrap a whole bunch of ELBs and configuration around that. But boy, I sure am going to leverage the model of event-driven thinking, and that's where I think I'm super excited about serverless.
So Abby, Cloud Foundry is serverless?
Yeah. Absolutely.
There you go.
Thank you.
So there you go. Yes, we are.
Yeah, I think that's why I was curious,
But then
how things are shaping up.
But then it's always been that way then.
Well, it's always been that way. I think And this actually ties back into where we started, which is new and shiny, and hype cycles, and that was actually the point of my keynote yesterday. Is, you know, there's a lot of evolution that's happening, and we get really excited about the new thing, and we forget about the evolution and the framework that sits underneath it. And, you know, on the foundation side, particularly in open source, we have to balance those two things constantly. Like, are we evolving fast enough to meet the needs of the changing market, but are we also ensuring stability and maturity of a platform that trillions of dollars run across? And so it's a constant balance on the open source side. And added to that balance is obviously a variety of needs from providers, users, what people want and expect from a platform that helps them write, fundamentally at the end of the day, cloud native applications.
Sure. Questions?
Real quick.
Greg?
Greg from Comcast again. I think
Oh, hold on a second so we can get you the mic.
Here for home viewers.
Thank you. I think what Cornelia said for me, you know, is really spot on, right? And, you know, I think that for us, like, serverless as a microservice with a half-life is not as interesting as solving problems with event-driven architectures. And there are some groups, not many, but there are some groups in Comcast that are solving things with more of an event-driven model, and I think that helps unlock, these new possibilities. So I think what Cornelia said, I think, is really spot on and something that, really should kind of marinate with the group. And, and then of course I'm thinking about, well, how do we apply that kind of thinking? Are there other models that we have where we're forcing it with the old model that should move to an event-driven architecture?
Great. There's anyone who hasn't had a chance to ask a question that would like to ask about their own challenges that they're facing, or a question that they just would like to have answered? Or do we know? All right, great. Oh, there's one right there. Great.
Hi, this is Pete, also from Pivotal. So, and Cornelia, you mentioned this. Pivotal really likes to express the importance of 12-factor services and how useful that is in software development. 12-factor is really it's focused on services. Now I'm thinking about functions and serverless. Does the 12-factor app methodology translate into functions and services or serverless where the unit is so much smaller? Or how do you establish the best practices for that?
Yeah, okay, so I'll start since it's a little propeller heady, but so the first thing is that I think a lot of the things do translate. I think that there are quite a number of patterns that still make sense. However, there are a whole set of new ones as well. Do I know what they are? Heck no. But I do think that, for example, I was chatting with somebody just this week, and gosh, if I could remember who it was, that would be great, but I can't, around what it means to do, it was Matt McNeely, so somebody who also works at Pivotal. What it means to, for example, in a 12-factor app, being able to do things like inject environment variables and do late binding, inject bindings, so binding a client to a service. So that binding in and of itself, and then how you communicate across that interaction, those are all things that are kind of part of the definition of cloud native applications. What does a binding look like if you're doing something that is just spinning up from 0 instances to 1? Because the expectation there is that usually the binding can happen at some point. The binding is then stable. That's why we use things like service discovery to do binding. But if I'm spinning something up for quick execution, do I have time to do that service discovery protocol? So maybe the answer there is to do something along the lines of service discovery a little bit earlier and kind of change that pattern. Then you've got that tension between binding too early and binding just in time. So I do think you're absolutely spot on. I think that there's a whole nother set of patterns that we're going to have to figure out. That, by the way, I think a lot of the theoretical computer scientists that have been doing it for decades, distributed systems used to be kind of something that was, I mean, there's 30-year-old books on distributed systems that talk about some of these algorithms and patterns. They just haven't been used in industry. But now that we're on the internet and everything's a distributed system, some of that research we're going to have to figure out how to realize that in the industry as a whole. So thank you for that question.
Great. So Stephen, I just have a last question then. So what's the importance now of open source? And now open source is changing so much. We're seeing a lot of change in the winds on all types of fronts. AWS, you wrote about, their open source distro for Elasticsearch. How do you help people make sense of this?
I don't think we have enough time for that. I mean, I guess what I'll say is that I think, what has been established pretty clearly is that open source, sort of is going to be a default from an infrastructure standpoint. I think the ongoing tension at this point is sort of largely between cloud providers and commercial providers of open source software, who are in many ways inherently in tension. We've seen a number of license changes. You referred to Elastic. Elastic made some changes to its licensing. Redis Labs has done the same. Mongo has done the same. So this has become sort of a pattern, from an industry standpoint, and threatens to essentially blur lines, between open source and proprietary software in ways that are not helpful, in my opinion. Chef yesterday announced essentially a different route. They took software that was previously proprietary and open sourced it, and are now sort of relying instead on trademark. So. Basically, there's a couple different directions. We can go down. We can go down a path, where essentially the bright line between open source and proprietary becomes a lot less bright.
Right.
In which case, then everybody in the room will have issues in terms of getting things in, using open source software. Then it's going to have to clear legal departments. You're going to be prohibited from using certain things because of weird license restrictions. Which that's not the path I hope we go down. There's another path we can walk down, which is, look, there are lots of different ways for commercial open source organizations to make money, and these weird Byzantine licenses are not the solution.
Abby, any last thoughts before we end?
Yes, all of that. I don't think changing licensing models to deter encroachment, I guess, is the best way to do it. I view it as, and I think, to bring that back to where we are, I think the best way for all of us to compete with open source is the constant execution and constant leveling up of the value you're providing. And that's true whether you're an enterprise that's using open source or you're a commercial open source company. But either way, you're constantly having to execute. And the challenge with the industry that we're in right now is that that's changing so much faster. Where 5 years ago you had a year, now you have like a quarter.
I'll spare Rick the questions about open source licensing, but I know that you're probably going through a lot of these different discussions yourself internally. But any last thoughts from you before we end the day?
All I was just going to say on that topic was we've been huge adopters of open source, and it's been fantastic for us. We, as an enterprise, we just embraced it 7-8 years ago, and it just has created a ton of great options for us. And so as an enterprise, I love having options, and open source has just given us a lot of opportunities.
Great. Well, I want to thank the panel for participating today. I want to thank all of you for being here for this discussion. Let's give a big hand to the panel. And before we go, we have the drawing for an Arduino.
Oh, you're going to let me do it?
There we go.
And just a last thank to Pivotal and Cloud Foundry. Let's give another hand. Let's give them another big hand. All right.
You ready?
Yes.
901354.
901354. We got a winner.
Anthony won.
There we go.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Alex.